And we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Global Citizens. My name is Kelvin. I am the show's host, and I am also its creator. So, my guest today is a buddy of mine who actually just finished his quarantine in Singapore. So, please give a round of applause to him. So, yeah, he is actually one of the coolest peacemaker I know, and he hosts his own podcast. And inadvertently, he actually is originally born as a Singaporean, but he is an American citizen by now. So my guest for today is Kyle Pang. Kyle is a TCK who calls LA, Singapore, and Shanghai his home. So apart from his day-to-day job, which is in tech sales, he hosts a TCK podcast, the third space. Through this creative outlet, he looks to uncover diverse cultural narrative to empower listeners to walk in their unique purpose and identity. So without further ado, I'll pass the spotlight back to Kyle to introduce himself. So Kyle, how are you, bro?
I am good, Calvin. Thanks so much for the nice intro, and it's an honor to be a part of this show. I think it's amazing to see what you've done, and also your curiosity to learn people's stories. And it's cool to be on this side of the table now. So really appreciate the intro. Good to be part of this, and looking forward to our discussion. I feel there's always so much to uncover, right? There's always more to learn, and the more that we're learning about the world, the more we realize that we have yet to learn. And so, yeah, happy to be here. Calvin, appreciate the intro once again. And yeah, as Calvin said, on my end, I think it's always important to find an outlet. So apart from the day job that a lot of us have, I think it's important to find a creative outlet. And for me, it's a podcast featuring diverse stories. And that's really part of the belief that stories often go untold or half told, and through that we're able to uncover that, and stories ultimately resonate with one another, right? So I think that's a lot of power, and that's where my curiosity takes me.
All right, bro. The very first question is compulsory for TCK. I'm sorry if you're gonna hit me for it.
Let's do it.
All right. How would you define home, bro? Go ahead.
Oh, here we go.
Yes.
I feel like the educational answer is that home is a relational place and not a geographical place. And I have to attribute my own research back in college to that definition. I did my final college capstone on third culture kids and how identity is cemented. And part of that because I was actually an intercultural comm major in college. I'm not sure if I told you that, Calvin, but that's how I define home. It's really a relational place. But I think if I were to add my own personal touch to it, I think that the key piece to it would be the introduction of home being a place that doesn't need further explanation, and why there could be certain number of countries or cities or people that make things home, and being able to build off instead of intense questioning. Why do you have more than one place? How do you do this, right? It's that innate understanding of home being very fluid.
Absolutely. All right. For those of you who just tuned into this channel for the very first time, Global Citizens is an online platform whereby I advocated TCK by inviting them. And I've also invited other ranges of global citizens, from digital nomads up to an international speaker. So what the main purpose of this is to let people know what is the real story behind it. Not some Insta-worthy pictures, not an extended vacation. The main purpose of it is intercultural studies and awareness. It's because, I want people to understand that it's not always sunshine and rainbows, and there are difficulties and challenges that we face living this lifestyle. Like Kyle and I, both of us are TCKs. So yeah, by inviting them and sharing their own stories, people actually get to hear what is it that they went through growing up. All right, Carl. So yeah, if you don't mind sharing with us, though, there's a term on this show called the TC Quest. It's basically TCK and Quest, whereby you actually tell about how it is your experience growing up as a TCK. Do you mind sharing us with that?
Yeah, I think let's give an overarching story, and then we can kind of delve into it bit by bit. But in a nutshell, born in LA, and essentially moved to Singapore at a very young age, at a couple of weeks old. And so I grew up in Singapore for 9 years, went to local school. My parents and family are Singaporean. Could turn on that Singlish switch too, which is nice.
Cannot.
Cannot, right?
Can.
What?
We definitely have to use English later. There's actually a request from one of our dear friend from TCK Global, but I will not reveal who that is. But I
Oh,
will just let her
shoot.
see later on. But yeah, go
Okay.
ahead. Sorry, Carl.
Let me know and I'll switch it on later. But yeah, so after 9 years in Singapore, local school, my dad got the opportunity to move to Shanghai. And then I lived there for 9 years, graduated from high school there. It is through my time in Shanghai that I went to international schools. I went to the Singapore International School as well as the American school there too. And then afterwards, the plan was always to return back to the U.S. So I went back to LA for university, and I've been there. This will be my 7th year, even though I'm in Singapore right now, as I'm transitioning different jobs. But that was that. I think if we want to talk about that experience of growing up outside from the years and the timeline there, I think it's really through my time in Shanghai that I understood what their culture kits were. I was big in the church community as my family's Christian. And so through that space, I think that's where the awareness got there. And I know some of us as TCKs might have grown up individually, and so you don't really have that collective discussion, right? But I think from a young age, I knew of this term, third culture kids. But only through my college years, that's when I was like, oh, wow, this experience really gives birth to a certain identity, a certain type of struggle, and there's beauty in that struggle too.
Right. All right. Which of your homes though do you have any particular fondness of any particular any of your particular homes?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's gonna be the last time I asked to choose which one is your favorite, I got a little bit of heat for that. So let's change the term and still deliver the exact purpose. All right, go.
Yeah, why not? Yeah, I know, right? It's so hard. For me, I only have 3 countries, so it's pretty simple. But for some of our mutual friends of like 8, that's when it really gets hard. And even with 3 countries, I feel that's so hard, right? Because each home has a different significance, correct?
Yeah.
But since I'm in Singapore right now, why don't we talk about Singapore?
Yeah.
I mean, Singapore is my cultural heritage, right? Singaporean culture, and even that in itself, it's pretty complex, right? Because there's not really a such thing as Singaporean, right? My great-grandparents moved from different parts of China to Singapore, right? So you kind of have so many layers to it too. But I think in terms of fondness, I think that this would be one of the most grounding places for home. Reason being, most of my family, my relatives are still in Singapore. And I think that even though Singapore doesn't really have a unique cultural Singaporean identity, quote unquote, as everyone's going to have different places, I would say that it's very rich in culture, and that the practices and heritage is very interesting, right? I think Singapore is a big foodie culture. And I think we in Singapore, I feel like really live to eat, right? And instead of eating to live. And so that's something that's always taking me back, just like that, to Singapore and my roots, right? Because I grew up eating in the hawker stalls. It's cheap, good food, not the most healthy, but there's so much stories behind that. And there's like Singaporean, like Chinese, Malay, Indian influences. So I think that's really key. And I think each time I come back here, it takes some time adjusting to the pace and everything. But I think one thing that I love about Singapore is that collective family feeling. That's something that I feel in America, regardless if you grew up there or not, it's more individualistic, but there's nothing wrong with that. But people are very focused on their individual pursuits. And sometimes you lose out in the community and you can feel a little lost.
Right. Yeah, I can relate to that. I actually only have 2 main culture, which is Indonesia and Singapore. I grew up in Singapore most of my life. I even served the national service, so it's pretty much ingrained to me. So while actually I may not have as much, well, the record on this show is actually somebody who has lived in 12 countries. So that's a lot more headache.
Not even close.
The record for the number of countries visited is I think 150. So
wow.
43 short left for every single country under the UN's charter.
Wow.
So and at that time, even though I may not have all that kind of experience, I guess, but when I hear all the stories, in a sense, you can relate to it. And I like what you mentioned regarding food, is because there's food stories and among some of the factors that people actually can bond. And I think that's the main thing when we are doing this kind of podcast, is like we want people to hear our stories, because
Mhm.
even though it may not be as much as how what you went through on an individual basis, but stories actually can relate people, because you can always see a certain similarity to it.
Yep, 100%. And I think even in stories, right? I mean, TCKs are such a niche, not saying that there's not a good amount of us, but it's interesting because, you know, after launching the podcast and having some of my American friends support me in that mix, it's fascinating to see how that also resonates, right? Because America is also a very diverse place where there's integration, right? You know, and
Yeah.
one of my good friends, his family's from El Salvador, and he's talking about, you know, there's a lot of similarities for him, even being American, right? And what does that mean? How does that happen in the sweet spot, right? How does he juggle his own cultural heritage and also expectations as an American to assimilate, right? Like, what does that look like? So I think it's fascinating. There's a lot of worldwide applications that we could use, especially in this globalized world.
Yep. Yeah. Totally agree. Totally agree, though. Okay, earlier you mentioned on your podcast, right? So, what was the motivation behind Third Culture Space when you created it?
Yeah,
And there
yeah.
really need to be a regulating body on what name what you want to propose for TCK podcast. There's so many of you guys with the word third culture. There's
Of
nothing wrong, but
course.
it's confusing. I think
Right,
there's two
right.
of them with the exact same name.
Oh no. It's good though. That means there are more content creators, right,
Oh,
doing
there
it.
is.
And
Of course, that's good. But the thing is, it's confusing. So, which podcast is yours? So,
mine is the third space. So third culture space is the handle.
okay.
No,
Yeah.
no complex or good reason. It's just the third space was already taken, so I had to get creative, and I thought third culture space was still on the money there. But I think in terms of the title is the third space. And I think the first question you're asking is what gave birth to the project, right?
Yeah.
And so this is actually an interesting story. Before I started working, I actually graduated a semester early back in 2017. And a reason for that is because back then, a lot of my college mentors were telling me, Kyle, take a break before going in the workforce, right? Don't rush into it, because taking vacation and everything, you'll never get that fully back. And I took that word to heart. And so I graduated a semester early and was able to really do a lot of reflective thinking. And so during that time, I also had money saved up. And so I went to Europe twice for 2 weeks each. Went to Germany the first time, where I studied abroad for 2 semesters in Heidelberg, beautiful place. And essentially, you know, I was just kind of thinking, like, what do I do with all this, right? Like traveling, connecting with people, like that's key. But how can I create? Like, how can there be something more than just pictures or memories, right? And so I'm someone that always loves stories, and I was just kind of inspired by Humans of New York, right? Kind of having like a good portrait picture, because a picture is worth 1,000 words, and also getting someone's story, like their caption, right? So I actually did that each time I went back to Europe, right? I mean, on my second time back to Europe, actually, when I went to the UK, and I got a bunch of my friends, a lot of people were based in London and that area. So got a lot of their stories then. And then obviously did that, came back to the US, and work started, and I was just trying to juggle getting these stories, and I'm being the perfectionist that I am. I'm like, is this even good? Like, how should I launch this, and how can I continue this, right? And so big time, you know, just kind of put that in the back burner, didn't really pay attention to it. And yeah, I really thought to myself, you know, in that year, that's back in 2018. So it's been almost 3 years. And I was thinking to myself, yeah, this is kind of hard to sustain. It's not like I can travel around the world, right? Because TCKs are all over the place. And so what is one sustainable way I could do this? And I thought to myself, I'm someone that loves to connect. I'm an intentional person. And so why not carve out, you know, half an hour with my good friends and have more of a focused conversation? Because I think the conversations we have are pretty enlightening. And so that kind of gave birth to pivoting, right, in life, to a different outlet, which is a podcast. And essentially when COVID first hit in the US in March, I said to myself, like, it's now or never. Like,
Yeah.
there's no better time to do this than now. And so I think it's really been a great learning experience. Like this whole idea of progress and not perfection, right? And I think when you see that as a means to practice, to hone your craft, you can never lose, right? So I think that's one thing after I gave birth to it. And then the second thing is like, what's your metric, right? That's something I always ask myself in life, whether it's professionally or personally. It's like, how are we measuring ourselves? Because there's a healthy way of doing it and also an unhealthy way of doing it, right? So I think for me, the podcast, and I know this applies to you too, Calvin, in our past conversations, that we're not here to just make money. We're not here to try to milk the system, right? Like, this is our passion. We're going to do it regardless of that, right? And so I think you can tell me if you agree with this. I think we take pride in more of having these stories resonate and actually helping people, right? That they come away with it with something new. They're coming away with it with more life in them, right? And so I think after doing that, I think, again, you can never lose. You're only winning.
I remember that it kind of resonated when I first started doing it. Of course, if anyone watching this and you want to give us some money, we're not gonna complain about it. We're not gonna complain about it. But yeah, when I first started doing this, it was because I was actually living in my family's property outside the city, which is like around 2 hours drive back and forth. It will take around 5 hours minus traffic and stuff. So at that time, funny enough, compared to my past videos, my video when I was recording my old studio actually gave me my highest ever views on my Instagram. So I'm like, wait, what? Compared to my past one. So that was really annoying to see that. But I'm actually happy about that because that very space was actually where I started doing it. It's because I was stuck in a city, I grew up in a city, and then suddenly I moved to a place that's so rural. And then suddenly, and you ask me to adjust to it, to immediately take this as a home. It's not something that I can easily do. So at that time, I was thinking, it's like, okay, what can I do? What can I do? And I think I have the same kind of epiphany as you. It is because, I can't travel anywhere. And so, okay, why don't I bring the people to me?
Exactly, yeah.
My first episode is actually the only one whereby I actually have the guest right beside me because he's actually an expat. But subsequently, of course, I need something which has a much more unique kind of presentation. And this is how Global Citizens came about. Whereas for the name is I actually try to avoid lawsuit because there's actually two organizations with the exact same name at that time when I started it. Yeah, in case you don't notice, there's a Cktizens.
Right.
CK is actually my initial. So, at that time, I really was just trying to avoid lawsuit. I have some cool story behind it, like, oh, there's no I, is because I'm trying to find who am I from. But the thing is, I'm just trying to avoid a lawsuit at that time.
Makes sense. Got to get creative, right?
Yeah. Oh, this is what the main purpose is. Funny enough, the thing is that I always advise TCK, like if you have difficulty adjusting back to the different culture, go and find some creative outlet. It can be something. If you want to create a sketchbook, go for it. If you want to make a diary, go for it. You need something to reflect back. It's because it's a sense of validation that your global life, it's not a lie. It happened. But the thing is that it may not be something that people can easily accept. A book won't judge you. A video won't judge you. It's just a tool. So go for it. Reflect who you are. And that's what I always encourage a lot of younger TCKs or even those who are older than me if they are having difficulty with cultural shock.
Yeah, Calvin, I love that point, right? It's like, I think for me on the side, I really love, understanding more of ourselves and, the psych piece of it. And so much of it is so valid, right? I think it's really moving from this place of passivity, right? We're like, oh man, this is a tough life. How do I negotiate it, right? And then doing something tangible that we're creating, like you said, that is actually making things more real and not just like a dream from the past, right?
Yep.
And so I think that's really crucial, Calvin. And I think this applies to like even people in depression, right? Like a lot of times people in depression, to get better, it's not just to go through counseling and take meds, but a lot of it's doing the things that you used to love, doing the things you're passionate about, in which through that you get out of the rut, right? So that's a whole different topic and it's nuanced too and complex. I'm not trying to generalize here, but I think like it's a very similar takeaway. Like, how can we get to a place where we can actually create, that we're not just stuck, and to make that so personal and life giving too.
Agreed. So let me ask you, man, what was your own experience with dealing with reverse culture shock? Because the thing is that back when I first came to Singapore, there used to be a show called ABC DJ, whereby a Chinese kid actually came back from Singapore, to Singapore from the US. So yeah, at that time, of course, I don't get what he was doing, because at that time I just moved to Singapore. So I thought, okay, it's nothing out of the ordinary. But as a grown up now, I realize, oh my God, now I get what was happening back then. So what about yourself, man?
My reverse culture shock, yeah. That's a good question. The first one that comes to mind, and I think first off, reverse culture shock can also appear in smaller settings, right? Even like, let's say like me coming back to Singapore now too, right? But I think the most prominent one would be me going back to the US after living in China. So I do have some relatives in the States. And also my parents actually went to school there. So we'll go back to the US probably like once every 2 years at least, I think, when we're growing up. And so thankfully it wasn't as foreign of a place. I know some friends that literally like never grew up in their home or passport country. Let's say they're Singapore, and the first time they come back to set foot and live for the long haul is to serve NS, and that's brutal, right? But for me, I think it was just more of moving back to the States and understanding the culture, because I did go to American school, but it was still tough nonetheless. I think a couple of things that I realized back then was, first off, realizing that, oh yeah, like some Americans actually like just never traveled out of the country or even their home state. And obviously that was, you can't really say that's a surprise, right? But at the same time, the Americans I grew up with in China are also Americans in China, so they know that there's a possibility for you to grow up in China and speak English, right? Whereas some people that are born and raised in the US, that's like a mind-blown fact to them, unfortunately. So things like that, right? I think the biggest thing I realized was that there's a pushback on my identity, where people start questioning or even saying, oh, meet Kyle, he's from China, right? And that gives birth to a boxed-in conversation where they're like, oh, you're from China? You know, and then I'm the token Chinese guy, right? And I really don't identify with that too, right? So I think that's one of the biggest things of reverse culture shock, is the pushback on our identity. And our identity is so unique because there's so many layers to it, right? There's like the personal element of how do we view ourselves, right? And then there's also the relational element, how others view us, or even a community, how are we attached to a certain community, right? And so I think on the relational end, that was definitely a tough part in reverse culture shock, because your personal identity, your self-concept was being questioned. And as an 18-year-old going back to their passport country, that can be pretty jarring, because you're trying to uncover yourself too, right? You're trying to understand, who am I, right? I know I'm this TCK thing, but should I say I'm an American? Should I say that I'm an American who grew up in Asia, in Singapore and Shanghai, right? And so I think during that time, I started to play around with my answer, right? I think a lot of us TCKs go through that. It's like the where are you from answer, that we can just do the dumbed down approach, right? I just say I'm from LA, which is true because I'm born there, I guess. So that's what I did. And yeah, depending on who's asking and just trying to read the room and see if there's going to be a further conversation and connection, that's when I dictate my answer. But I think that's really the biggest thing, my identity, pushback there. And I think in terms of more practical things, a big culture shock, I guess, or reverse culture shock would be just like the social system, right? So I think it's about like even LA as a city is such a driving city, and growing up in Singapore and Shanghai, you don't need a car really. You can just take the subway, the metro, the MRT, right? And so that's another big thing. I had to learn how to drive. I had to learn how do I fit in as an individual in this society, right? So those are like two things that I think about that are practical, and also more of the reflective part of myself as well.
Yeah, I get that. I truly am not a really good driver, just to be honest. Because, yeah, like what you mentioned, growing up in Singapore, we don't need a car because yeah, we have a very efficient transport system, and we
Mhm.
are pretty much discouraged from getting a car since it's incredibly expensive.
Very
So
discouraged.
yeah,
Jeez.
and might as well we just take the public transport anyway. It's not much of a hassle most of the
Mhm.
time.
Yep.
So suddenly I need to come back to Indonesia to drive, and I need to learn to drive. And sometimes in a road that seems incredibly impossible, it's like an incredibly narrow road with two cars, and I have no idea why people like to use gigantic sized car here when it's such a heavy traffic. So yeah, I can relate to that, man.
Mhm.
Can I ask you something though? Like
Please.
a lot of times when TCK tend
Mhm.
to move to a new country, in a sense, it feels like a grieving stage. It's like, in a sense, you might not know. It's not that anyone passed away or anything, but it's just that, well, you never know whether you are going to rejoin back with your older culture. You don't know how it's gonna be. You may not even see all the people there. While nothing bad happens, in a sense that no life was lost, you feel in a sense that you went through your own sense of depression. It's because you are taken away from what you are familiar with. It's like losing an old friend, if you want to put it right. What do
Mhm.
you feel though within all of your homes that makes this kind of, in a sense, grieving stage easier for you to accept the other culture, or in fact you create your own personal culture, which is a TCK thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is actually a funny thing to admit. And I did allude to this a couple times in my podcast, but I actually never went into it. So I guess this will be the first time. So some context before I moved back to the US is that I kind of had this, oh man, I don't want to say the word idolization. It really dumbs me down. But I had this idea that, oh, America was good. I mean, it is a good country. Don't get me wrong. It has its issues too, but I enjoy it. But I was excited to go back to America, right? And kind of live that free life and, explore nature and everything. I was very, very, very excited. And so my plan going back to the US was actually to just fit in as an average Joe. Just, I'm done with moving around. I'm done with the Asian side. I'm finally excited to just be Asian American and live my best life, I guess, and then just settle there, right? So
Yeah,
different from who I am now. But that was my plan. And as I said before, that's when I started getting pushback. And I was like, even though I want to be American, even though I want to just fit in and just be normal, I am still viewed as something else. Like I have a different layer, a different box attached to me, right?
yeah,
So, yeah, I would say that when I first came to the US, I was just very excited. I was very excited for a new stage and I was excited for the move. So I didn't really go through like a grieving stage. I was actually super, super pumped. However, my grievances came after I studied abroad. So I really didn't intend to study abroad. I was like, oh, I'm good. I'm good with traveling. I've done that enough. I was kind of jaded by it, honestly. And I studied abroad because my friends were doing it. I know it's the dumbest reason, right? But I went to Heidelberg, Germany for 2 semesters, and it was a wonderful time. We traveled every weekend. And on top of just seeing different places, I realized that I also had many friends in Europe that I could visit. So during that time, on top of just really tapping to my why, tapping in my curiosity for other cultures and living this like nomadic life, I was able to reconnect to friends. And I started to realize that all of us are kind of going through this, not really grievance process, but also more of like this uncovering of identity, understanding how we fit into the mix. And that was an extremely um, fulfilling time because I felt so enriched, right? My senses were all enhanced. I was just like, wow, trying different foods, seeing different architecture, traveling alone, right? Meeting new people, meeting old friends, catching up on how we're doing. And when I came back to LA, I was so lost. I think that was the most like lost I ever felt in my life. And so I think going back to your question and the examples you provided is that I think in Germany, I really found myself and learned that this TCK identity shouldn't be forgoed. It's so valuable and it's who I am. It's there. It literally enables me to make Europe a home, even though I never really traveled there extensively growing up, right? And so going back to the US, being stuck, and back then I didn't have a car. I was stuck in my grandpa's place in Chinatown, and that was a tough time. But it's so fascinating because I think it was only tough because I found myself more when I was studying abroad, right? And
Yeah.
so it really is a plus, right? And so during that time, how I reconciled it, right? That's kind of your question of how do I create the identity. It was tough in terms of finding meaning, but all the more I started finding more mentors. I started finding more outlets, right? I started thinking more about life, the meaning, the purpose, how do I fit in there? And I started thinking, maybe I don't need to stay in the US. I actually want to travel abroad. I actually want to continue this life. So that was a big pivotal shift.
There's nothing. Well, I told people is that your TCK identity is not a shame. It has to be a badge of honor. It's something that you live with. Why do you need to be embarrassed by it? And some people deal with it differently. I know that one of my upcoming guests, actress Miss Elizabeth Liang, actually mentioned that in the past what she liked to do is she maintained silence. It's because at that time was she feared if she expressed her grievances to her parents, it could be something like, oh, it's going to be, I worry that they may not understand and I may lose the only constants in my life. For
Mm.
myself, I actually have a funny enough when I first started adjusting to it is that I actually lash out because I was young. Yeah, I was an aggressor. Where to adjust to it is because I was younger at that time, and well, I was 2 years older than most of my classmates because I came into Singapore as a primary school student. I'm bigger than a handful of them, but the thing is that I did what I didn't know. What actually there are those who are actually older than me within that very same level, and there are those who are the same age as me. So for at least like around a year, I actually kept to myself. I just became a good student. But after a while, I just grew bigger than them. Then if they want to, in the past, they used to bully me, but in the end, I ended up bullying them. But after a while, I'm like, oh, you know what? This is just childish. It's ridiculous. So, okay, you guys leave me alone. I'll leave you guys alone. So that's the story of how, in a sense, it formed a certain mindset. Is that inside of sinking, I decided to swim. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's quite interesting how we deal with it, I guess. But all in all, I always encourage a TCK to never be ashamed of who you are. You live this life. It's something
Mhm.
that should be embraced. And well, with how while COVID sucks, we can't travel.
Mhm.
We actually become a lot more global than we ever thought would be. It's possible. It's because we actually embrace a certain aspect of workplace. Like for example, virtual work become a really common stuff in throughout these 2 years, and now people start to realize, oh, we don't always have to be in the office. We can actually start working at home. So
Mhm.
we just need to learn how to adjust to it. And I really hope this is something that carries on even after the pandemic ends, is because, well, we can't stay stagnant in the way the world is, right?
Yeah, 100%.
All right. Speaking of jobs, though, I kind of want to ask, how did you end up in work as a sales tech? So,
Yeah,
why I
yeah, yeah.
ask this, of course, is this. So, out of the 78 episodes, I tend to realize that TCK tend to go for a job which is more purpose driven as compared to career driven. I mean,
Yeah.
there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong being in the sales tech. There's nothing wrong. It's an awesome job. But the thing is that when people are actually doing that, they tend to do it in a more entrepreneurship way, as in they are running a startup. So in a
Mhm.
sense, they still fulfill the capacity to be innovative, to be free, to do whatever they please. For yourself, though, why do you choose this job?
Yeah. I feel like for me, it's actually rather simple. I don't think I really put a lot of effort in terms of understanding what career path that I want exactly, and I don't really put or paint this strict vision of what it should be like. And I'm still thinking, right? I think we find purpose in different ways, and um, I think in tech sales is definitely a very business driven career, right? Very revenue driven. But I think what made me really chose that is it's really more of a stepping stone, right? I don't see myself in sales for 40 years, right? But in this time, in this moment, I think that this is a good next step, right? And a couple of reasons I think it's huge. It's because sales is such a soft skill sort of career path, right? You learn how to communicate, you learn how to ask good questions. I think that's very, very underrated skill in life. But you learn how to ask good questions. So you just learn how the business world speaks things and operates, right? And so I think in terms of paths in the future, obviously I'm so open to so many and I'm still discovering myself, right? That's why I have a creative outlet too. But in this time and moment, I think that this is a place that works that can lean to my curiosity. And also the number one thing I looked for actually coming out of college was just for a global company. So that's why I started at Oracle, a pretty big tech company in the world, and to just understand how that works as a whole. And to not get myself in a siloed position, right, a smaller company. So that's kind of where I started, and I think it's been a good journey. Sales is not easy. Sales is very numbers driven, as I said, and so there are many ups and downs. So even regulating my own emotions, regulating my own boundaries of what I can control, what I cannot control. But I think it's also just like one part of life. I was never someone that really focused on career as my mission. I kind of more of like holistic person and what I enjoy, what I focus on.
Yeah, I used to be in sales also in the past. Well, the thing is that one funny part is that you tend to realize more about yourself more
Yeah.
as compared to, well, I mean, you need to make the numbers, but a lot of times actually what I wanted to do is just, okay, I just clock in the target, I just have a little bit of extra, then okay, I can do whatever I want to do after that. So in a sense, well, I mean, there's no career that is bad unless it's something that is forbidden by law, of course. The show doesn't encourage that, by the way. But yeah, but the thing is that we tend to want to do something with a much more bright approach. We want the idealistic approach, I guess, such as when you were younger, I guess, when you were heading back to the US. But the thing is that, well, if you actually take to actually get to know the moment, you realize that there's actually a lot more benefit than you ever thought it's possible, and you discover a little bit more about yourself.
100%. And I think this is a conversation I had with Ellie actually in part of our TCK global group.
Yeah,
And I think that one thing that she brought to light is that, American culture or even Asian culture, we're so goal driven, right? We want to
yeah,
say, this is where I want to be. This is where I want to go. How do I get there, right? And she kind of unpacked kind of her own approach in terms of living the day to day to be process driven, right? In which we focus on making the most of the day and understanding what gives us life, what takes away life from us, right? And doing good, it's a reverse approach in which certain goals will be naturally achieved too, right? So I think that's what life is, right? I know this sounds cliche, but it's always a moderation. It's always finding the sweet spot. So that's something I try to do, right? As I feel like a lot of times we can get caught up like, oh my gosh, like, is this place right in terms of where I'm going? But I think it's to focus on the day to day, to focus on your processes and having perfect processes, right? That will
yeah.
lead to, what's life giving. And I think that's how the world works. You attract people that you're like, and being true to yourself, being genuine, being authentic. I think that open up avenues and pathways that you wouldn't really know, right?
Yeah, and authenticity is something that is really rare, and actually, it's something that I think has been missing in a lot of today's world. So, I'm actually coming up with an article called the 3G generation. So, the first G stands for globalization, and the last
Okay.
G stands for generational differences. Now, the
Huh.
second
Okay.
G is actually, there's two of them. There's actually a contrasting point. So, G stands
Okay.
for gadgets versus going to the person itself or ingratiating. So why I
Mm-hmm,
mentioned that is because when, well, when just like you, I guess, as growing up in Indonesia, well, my main influence of English is American movies and music. So I always envisioned that place as an idealistic place, but well,
yeah.
I've never been there personally. Like, I don't know if I've never been in New York City, I would assume that some of the stereotypes that they put from How I Met Your Mother is how peoples in New York used to live. So I don't know how it is, but the thing is that when you are in the location itself, I think you learn more about it, and I think this. the stereotype is something that is unfair, but the thing is that, well, I think it could be something that is dissolved with the way the world is becoming more global nowadays. Yeah. All right, man. I actually have one really fun question. I think a lot of my questions usually is quite deep. It's like it
I
makes
love
you.
it. I love going deep, but fun
All right.
questions are welcome too. Let's do it.
No
What
pun
is it?
intended. The going deep has no pun intended, people. All right. All right, man. If you can create something like, I don't know, maybe a TV show or even a movie or even a book to actually makes you realize to actually advocate the TCK lifestyle. Because the thing is that there's actually a lot of TCK in this world who are public figures, but the thing is, well, they have never been explicitly stated to be TCK. The late Kobe Bryant, people will always assume him as African American who lived in Italy before. Former President Barack Obama, he's a TCK, but, well, people will just recognize him as the first African American president.
Yes.
There's
Yes.
a lot of notable figures who are TCK, but has never been specifically admitted up as a TCK. So, if you can create something like this, what would you want to create though to actually represent a TCK life that you live?
Yeah. Good question. I think if I'm choosing the medium, I'll do film. And more of like a docu-series. I'm not saying that I'm a talented filmmaker, but I think that film is a good way to tell stories, obviously, and I always enjoy like good, little docu-series on food and things like that on Netflix, right? But I think it's really to label it, right? As you said, I think the world has its way of keeping things simple, right? And keeping things surface level, not in terms of being superficial, but it's more on what our eyes can perceive, right? Kobe Bryant's black, Barack Obama's black, first black president,
Let's see.
African-American
Freddie
basketball player,
Mercury is British, but he's actually not.
right? Yeah. So I feel like that's a problem, right? That we're taking away all these other intricacies of life, right? Putting it in a very literally like black and white place,
Yep.
right? And so I think this is a great question because I like to ask myself time to time and also have these conversations with friends. It's like, if you had all the money in the world, like what would you do, right? And for me, it kind of relates to your question. And for me, I think it's really like having kind of like an Anthony Bourdain approach to cultures, right? Like he's going there not to just commentate and say this food is good and this food has what history, but he's actually having connections with people, right? On the state of the government, the state of culture, how that influence food, right? And I think that's kind of the same approach that I would do, where it's not really us trying to educate people, but really having the people tell their stories and using terms to describe it in a way that is more awareness driven, right? So I think that's really key. And exploring avenues like food, for instance, like chefs that do that, right? Or even people like entertainment that identify that way, right? And really getting into the identity and purpose. I think that's very key. So I guess you could even say it's going to be a kind of like the Third Space podcast that I host, but transferring that into more of a digital medium of video and sound. So I think that's what's going to be key.
All right. Yeah, that's a cool answer, man.
I appreciate it. Got the stamp of approval from Calvin. Yes.
Yeah, I would have wanted to create something which can rival either Star Trek or Star Wars, but yeah, that's me.
That's the name of today's episode, right? I'm not even a Star Wars guy, but I get the reference.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, the thing is that, well, medium has always been really important, I guess. Like as I mentioned, if I've never lived in New York City, I would assume everybody lived the life that is in How I Met Your Mother, but it's not true, right? No. But the thing is that the importance of medium is that it's a representation of who we are, I guess, and I guess the art of trying to deliver it to represent it is something that is important. So yeah, I love what you're doing, man. I love what you're doing.
Appreciate it. It means a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. This is going to be my last question, actually.
Okay.
What do you feel has been the ultimate blessing as a TCK? And just
Yeah.
to be fair also, what do you think has been a curse being one?
Yeah. That's literally what I call the TCK identity, and I sum it up by this. Being a TCK is a blessing and a curse, a gift and a curse, right? And the older I get, the more I realize it's more of a blessing than a curse. That's how I usually sum it up. I think the curse is the negotiation as a young adult or a teenager, as that's something all people go through, identity, right? And you're adding the layer of however many cultures you've been a part of, and cultures in itself has so many things attached to it, right? Whether it's language, religion, norms, like there's so many things, right? So you're adding those layers to reconcile that. And so I think the curse from that is like things that I shared before, right? That is like me finding myself in Germany, understanding that I can live this life that is actually very purposeful, and I never found myself in that space. And then going back to LA, where you're like, oh no, I'm back here, and how do I make the most out of the situation when I don't have a car, when I feel a little lost, I don't really have a sense of community here, right? And so that's more of the curse that comes from it, because this can be very disorienting. And thankfully for me, I never had too many or major like mental health struggles, but I know a lot of TCKs go through that, which is so tough. And so I think even an interesting question is like, how is the world, how does the psych feel, progressing in terms of globalization and this dynamic and this trend, right? Obviously, there's a lot of biculturals in the world, right? And people that are mixed race, or even in the US, where there's the hyphenated Americans, right? So I think that's very, very key. And I wonder how that's going to progress, as that's a much needed place to have people to guide us and be our true north. And I think the gifts from it are extensive. I'm not sure if we're going to speak Singlish after this, but I think that's one, right?
You want to speak English now also can.
Yeah,
shout out to Hiji. Actually, this is actually her request.
Hiji?
So,
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, Hiji, this is for you then. Yeah, so I think, right, being a Singaporean or American, right, you can switch your accent like this, but sometimes a bit forced because it's not, you're not my relative, right? So I didn't grow up with you speak like that, right? But it's good because, I think a good thing about TCK is not that you come back, right, and then you're like, oh, I'm American, I'm different, right? To my cousins here, like I'm Kyle, right? And this is who I am. I speak like this, right? So I think that's really one of the plus points, right? That you can switch your accents back and forth. And it's also a deeper question though, because sometimes I'm like, okay, sometimes like when I get more deeper subjects, I think my mind goes to the American side.
Yeah,
so,
you're not there, you're not there, you're not everywhere.
Yeah, because the thing is that when I grew up in Singapore, right, like my joking language, my joking styles, my simple communication to family is tied to Singlish, right?
Yeah.
So right, relatives ask me how I'm doing, right? If I have any girlfriend, right? Classic Singaporean topics.
Yeah,
like,
boy, are you married already or not?
Yeah, no, I don't need no rush, right? But when as I'm developing, right, my Shanghai identity, that's when I kind of claim more of this, like, you could say fluid accent, and then more American after I went to the American school, right? It's attached to more of my growth mindset, my experiences, right? So sometimes I talk more deeper subjects with my cousins and stuff, and I find myself like going back to this accent, right? But I think the beauty is that, right? It's like the ability to code switch and meet people where they are, see people for who they are, be the bridge builder, right? And I think even in that extent, it's also a growth journey on my end. I remember I used to be, wouldn't say ashamed, but I would like think that, oh, American English is better, which I think in a business setting, sure, right? I'm not going to go in a customer meeting and speak Singlish in America. I think that's a little off-putting, right?
Oh, you can't do that.
Yeah,
right. You can't even speak Singlish when you're in Singapore trying to do a business, man.
Yeah, right. So I mean, like, there's a time and place for that, but how do we do that out of respect? How do we do that out of a place that we're actually retaining culture? I think Singlish is a beautiful thing that gave birth, right? And I think that I should, like you said about the TCK identity, we should be proud about it, right? That we can switch that way. So I think that's one thing. It's not even a language, I guess. It's a different accent, pidgin English. I don't know how you want to. I'm pretty sure this is a more educational term, but I think that's key. And I think the number two thing is like this is a very tangible thing, but having friends all around the world, like, it's so awesome when I was in Europe to be able to stay in different places and not having to pay, right? But I think ultimately it's not just the money savings, but the ability to see how my friend's life is, to see what the local style and local way of living is, because there's so much beauty in that. I enjoy that so much more when I'm traveling, more than seeing the sights and checking off the bucket list. Maybe, yeah, it's the first time you're visiting London. Yeah, you should go through, the tourist attractions, right? But it's the beauty, especially in big cities like New York, London, LA. There's so much of the life that is interesting that you want to learn and see what that's like, right? So I think that's number two. So I got language, tangible, having friends abroad. And I think third is just like, again, going back to this bridge builder concept, I feel it's a little overused, right? But it's true. And I think that we can take intention that we're not seeing life as one way to do it, right?
Yeah.
But having respect and also,
it's like a flip side of the coin that you can see actually multiple sides to it.
exactly. And I think that's a thing, right? In today's world with racial relations and where we're going, right? Not even just racial relations, but even country, right? International relations, right? We have no tolerance, right?
Yeah.
And so how do we build tolerance? And I think that comes from that willingness not to accept that you're wrong, but to accept that your thinking is one way of thinking amongst many others, right? And so I think as TCKs, we kind of see people for who they are instead of the labels, the skin color that they have, right? Or the countries they call home, and have this understanding, but instead giving everyone the benefit of the doubt, giving everyone the blank slate to say, hey, tell me who you are. Like, I want to learn who you are, who that you say you are, right? And I think that's what we need in the world. I think in the end, I've been having a lot of conversations with some of my friends on this. It's like, human beings, we're social beings, and our basic need, right, obviously is love. But I mean, if we were to put that in more of a tangible way, is to be seen. We want to be seen. We want to be understood, known by people, TCKs and non-TCKs alike. It's just an innate human need. So I think as TCKs, understanding that we know that there's more than one way of thinking, and also understanding and experiencing the pushback that we got to be understood, all the more, I don't think it's something that we should be bitter about, but to be that and offer, a lens to see people. I think that's very, very key. And I think on the human level, apart from career, apart from the professional element of, my day-to-day tech sales, apart from even the podcast, we can live lives of purpose in the day-to-day, to recognize people, to call people by their name, someone who works as a cashier, right? I know it depends from culture to culture, but that's something I always do in LA, in the US, where that's pretty socially acceptable. Like taking the time to read the employee's, name card right here, and you can see their eyes just brighten up just like that. Like, oh, I'm seen, right? I'm not just a cashier. I'm not just a butcher, right? So I think that's very, very key that I think about personally. And through that, life is fun, apart from all the big things that we're achieving that are important too. But we can also win at the little things, to be bridge builders in the little things, to see people in the little things. And that's something I need to improve on, because sometimes we get so caught up with what we're doing, with where we're going, right? So again, being back to process driven, I think that's key.
All right. That's actually all the questions I had. So, okay lah.
Wow, what an honor. Kenna.
Ken already. All right. So yeah, shout out to Hiji. We speak Singlish for your requests.
Yeah. Is there any other English things I should talk about, Hiji?
Yeah. Okay. So this episode, for those of you who may not be able to catch it live, this episode will be on my IGTV later on, and it will be also on my YouTube and my LinkedIn, and they all are under my name or my brand name, which is Global Cktizens. As I already explained, how did the name came about. So with that, I actually just want to wish everyone, you stay safe, take care of yourself, because, we surpassed 1 year with COVID, but, we don't know how it will be this year. I mean, we already got we already have received news about vaccine, but, it's still something new. We still don't know about it. Hopefully, this thing will pass by soon, and we can carry on with our everyday life, or as we want to call it, a new kind of normal. So with that, I just want to thank Kyle for coming in today. I hope you enjoy yourself.
Let me do a plug for you too. First off, Calvin, thanks again for having me on here. It's an honor. Enjoyed this conversation. And again, we're only scratching the surface. There's so many more out there. So whoever's listening in, glad that you listened in. I think we both have interesting stories. I'm sure you do have. You have too. So subscribe, like, share to Global Citizens here. Talk to Calvin. He's a wonderful guy. And, I think as creators, and you yourself as a listener can be a creator too, to have the conversation open, to encourage, to live life that in a way that's positive, that it's encouraging driven, right? So I think that's key. And I know that will mean a lot to Calvin. And, I can speak of that as I host my own podcast too. But I think that's very key, to just support and to continue and do life together. It's so fun to do it when you're and so fun to win together instead of winning alone, right? So subscribe again, Global Citizens. Appreciate the time and opportunity here, Calvin. Really do.
Yep. Just to add on also, if you guys are interested to create your own podcast, there's a $10 credit for StreamYard located in the description box. And there's also a Canva credit if you want to create your own graphics. And with that, that's the end of episode 78 of Global Citizens, conversation with the one and only Obi-Wan Kylenobi.
Hey, yo. Deuces.